Tonight is the first time we've done the Big Money Speaker Series in quite a few months. Big Money Speaker Series is hosted by Missouri River Relief. We're a nonprofit in Columbia, Missouri, that is dedicated to connecting people to the Missouri River through um, through education and river cleanups and recreation. So direct experiences. That's kind of what we're all about. But one of the things that we've been doing for a little over 10 years is the Big Money Speakers Series. We took a little break towards the end of last year. It was a super busy year for us, and we just decided to cut a couple things off the to-do list. So I am super excited that we're kicking things off again in 2022 with the speaker series. And kind of a cool thing, I've been with friends and partners, been kind of organizing the speaker series for most of the 10 years that we've been doing it. So I'm pretty excited that this year I'm kind of passing the torch to Kristen Schulte, our education director. So you'll be seeing kind of a different flavor to the speaker series, I think, coming up this year. And she has been working really hard already to line up speakers, for presenters throughout the year. So I know we don't yet have somebody for February. So, some of the people in the crowd here, don't be surprised if Kristen reaches out to you in the next few days for a little emergency February presentation. Or if you have ideas on somebody that has something ready to go, feel free to reach out to us. But after that, I don't have the calendar in front of me to let you know kind of what she's got cooking, but we'll be sharing that in the Missouri River Relief emails. Just a few kind of highlights. I know we've got someone talking about some of the movements along the Missouri River during leading up to the Civil War. So some of the Underground Railroad movements of people out of slave states into Kansas using the Missouri River. That'll be really exciting. I'm not sure if she's got a date nailed down for that one yet. We've got a couple artists, Brian Haynes and Libby Reuter, will be speaking to the speaker series about their perspectives on the river, the meaning that they find in the river through their art. Really looking forward to those two. We've got some scientists lined up as well. So it's going to be a whole new year for the speaker series. I hope you guys can join us. There's a couple things I want to point out that we've got coming up this spring. First of all, usually in February, we would be hosting the Wild and Scenic Film Festival. And this fall, we decided to also take that off of our to-do list with the kind of the uncertainty around the pandemic at the time and the assumption that what's happening right now might be happening. Plus just kind of the busy fall that we had running the Big Money Clean Sweep and all kinds of stuff. Just decided to take a year off. So we hope to bring the Wild and Scenic back in 2023. So just hang tight for that. And a couple cleanup events that we've got coming up. April 9th, we will be heading back to Kansas City, actually probably Sugar Creek, just east of Kansas City, for river cleanup there. And then May 19th, we'll be returning to Washington, Missouri for a river festival and cleanup there. So I am, the real reason you guys are here tonight is because we have a couple of really, really smart and important people at the Missouri Department of Natural Resources that kind of can give us an overview of some of the different ways that the Missouri Department of Natural Resources works to protect the water quality and the habitat along the Missouri River. So we're joined by the Kansas City Regional Director, Karen Rouse, who has been working on Missouri River issues for many years. And also Chris Wieberg, who is with the Water Protection Division of Missouri Department of Natural Resources. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to start out with Karen's presentation, and we'll stop for question and answer after Karen is done with her presentation. And I'll be kind of moderating the questions for both of them. And then Chris is going to go into his talk. So Karen's talk really focuses in particular on the work that that Missouri Department of Natural Resources has done with the Mr. Rick Committee, which is the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee. And I'll let Karen describe what Mr. Rick is. She's going to do a way better job than I would. And then Chris is going to particularly touch on a study in progress that he's working on to quantify the input, sort of the nutrient input from Missouri, the state of Missouri, into the Missouri River and the Mississippi River watershed. That is part of that, contributing factor to the Gulf Hypoxia Zone. So Chris will kind of fill us in on that latest study, why it's important, and some of the ways that we, as a society, impact the Missouri River. So kind of a broad little brush, focusing on a couple pretty specific but very large issues related to the Missouri River. So really grateful for both of you to join us today. And Chris, since we didn't get a chance to talk right before the presentation, I'll let you know, once Karen gets going, if you wouldn't mind muting your audio and stopping your video, and then you can restart things after we're towards the end of the question and answer period too. So one last thing before we get rolling, you guys can submit questions throughout the presentation. If you're watching this on Zoom, there should be a question and answer, a Q&A icon down at the bottom. That's probably the best way to submit your questions. There is also the chat feed, which you can use as well. And the chat feed will allow you to talk to either specific presenters or to everyone as a whole. But probably the easiest for us to manage is the Q&A. So go ahead and use that. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave comments there as well. I'll do my best to capture any questions that you might have there too. So, so we'll kick it off with Karen. And Karen, thank you so much for joining us tonight with the Big Muddy Speaker Series.
Thank you, Steve. Audio check, just want to make sure that you can still hear me.
Karen, it looks like your audio is not working now, so I know.
Of course. What about now?
Other people say that they're hearing her. I think the problem is on my end. So Karen, just go right ahead. Okay. It sounds like they're hearing you.
Okay, so thank you, Steve. Again, my name is Karen Rouse. I obviously am with the Department of Natural Resources and be talking about stakeholder interest on the Missouri River and an update on species recovery. I'm going to go ahead and start my slides so you don't have to look at my face. So hopefully you are seeing big screen. So I'm not the only one that is working on Missouri River issues for the department. Michael Weller and John Horton with the Water Resources Center are we're like a 3-person team working on that. And so I want to introduce you to them as well, to myself. Michael and John are with the Water Resources Center. Like I said, Michael is the surface water section chief, and he's been with the department for 15 years. And John is the water policy and science team lead, and he's been with the department 18 years. So they're still with the Water Resources Center. I used to be there about 3 years ago. I came over here to Kansas City Regional Office to lead the team here. But overall, I've been with the department for 24 years now, having spent 18 of those years in the Water Resources Center, and the majority of that time focused on Missouri River and other state other interstate water management issues. In putting together this presentation, I kind of did a little bit of a flashback of my own. And I think my first Missouri River meeting was a Scaphorhynchus conference in St. Louis in January 2005. And not only did I learn how to pronounce Scaphorhynchus during those couple of days, but I was able to dive right into the science. And hearing it directly from those that are doing the research was incredibly invaluable. And I think there are several people on the Zoom this evening that presented at that conference. And I've enjoyed the personal and professional relationship I've been able to build with those that I've spent the majority of the last 20 years with. But my role in the department in this regard has morphed over time, even from being that science person in 2005 to then becoming more of the science and policy person. So Michael, John, and I represent the state of Missouri on the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee, also known as Mr. Rick. I'm the primary for the rep. I'm the primary rep for the state. Michael is the alternate, and John serves on the fish work group along with Casey Whiteman from the Department of Conservation. For those of you that were around in March 2017, part of River Release, who probably or at the Big Muddy Speaker Series in Rochefort in March 2017, I presented alongside Dr. Jacobson and Dr. Galat when we discussed the Corps of Engineers draft environmental impact statement. And one of the aspects of that EIS was the establishment of an adaptive management program. So here we are now, nearly 5 years removed from that presentation, and I thought I would just give a high-level overview of where we are now and an update on recovery efforts. But first, it's important to understand where a lot of that dialogue is taking place, and that's within Mr. Rick. But before we get to Mr. Rick, I am a geographer at heart, so just kind of want to give you a little bit of a orientation to where the Missouri River Basin is, or state of Missouri is in the whole scheme of things. So we're literally in the middle of things, and also figuratively. We are a downstream state in the Missouri River Basin and the upper Miss River system, but an upstream state to the lower Mississippi River. And DNR has involvement, obviously, in Mr. Rick, as well as the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association, the Lower Mississippi River Conservation Committee, and have historically been involved with the Arkansas White Red Basin Commission. So, interstate water issues often involve migratory species, and that's definitely the case with the Missouri River. Three listed species that are central to the adaptive management program and discussions within Mr. Rick are the piping plover, the interior least tern, and the pallid sturgeon. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide is the present-day known range of the pallid sturgeon, ranging from the Gulf of Mexico to western Montana. And construction of the lock and dam system on the Upper Miss and the dams on the Missouri River have contributed to the fragmentation of that historical range. Again, Steve, I really need to thank you for allowing me to speak because, like I said, I've taken a little bit of a trip down memory lane, and it's allowed me to share this photo with you and with everyone. Very rewarding and unique experience I had on the river one time. Well, anytime I was able to get on the river through my tenure there in the Water Resources Center was incredibly rewarding. This one particular time, my coworker, Matt Patello, the red bearded fella there, and I helped the Fish and Wildlife Service with broodstock collection. And so on this particular day, we wound up pulling up 2 pallid sturgeon that wound up going to the hatchery. And this was just one bend upstream of Boonville. So it was an incredibly rewarding day on the river. Incredibly rewarding day at work for me. So thank you to the Fish and Wildlife Service for allowing us to help you out that day. So what is the Mr. Rick? Mr. Rick was established by Congress through the 2007 Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, to advise the Corps on species recovery. It's that last section where it says existing Missouri River recovery and mitigation plan, where the Missouri River Recovery Program now exists. And when the Mr. Rick Charter was written, we decided to keep that WRDA language directly into the Mr. Rick Charter, which was signed in July of 2008. The recovery program consists of 3 parts. Mitigating for habitat loss from the Bank Stabilization and Navigation Project, or the BSNP, requirements of the biological opinion, and WRDA 2007 that I just mentioned. Mr. Rick is comprised of stakeholder groups, basin tribes, basin states, excluding Minnesota, and federal agencies that have an interest in the basin. Even though there are many federal agencies around the table, it's the Corps and the Service that are the lead federal agencies. And you'll notice the stakeholder groups, there's quite a list, but it's a varied list on purpose. You have all 8 authorized purposes that are represented, as well as a couple of others. So like major tributaries. So there's representation from the Yellowstone River there. At one point, there has been representation from the Platte River on Mr. Rick, but there's also environmental groups that are represented, as well as thermal power and waterway industries. And by and large, the stakeholder groups, they're trying to balance between upstream and upper basin and lower basin. So like perhaps recreation interests on the upper river aren't exactly the same on the lower river. So the Corps tries to have representation from both sections. And I know that there's a lot of federal agency groups listed on this slide as well. And just because they have an opportunity or are invited to sit at the table, not everybody equally participates. Like USGS, they certainly have a much larger involvement in Mr. Rick through the science program than somebody like from from Maritime or the Forest Service. So they have a seat at the table, and typically they are there when there's something that directly pertains to their mission statement for their agency. And Scott Mansker with River Relief, which most of you probably already know, he is an alternate for recreation on the lower river. And Larry Shepard is the primary representative on Mr. Rick for lower basin recreation interests. So like I said, all federally recognized Native American tribes in the basin also have a seat at the table, including the Osage Nation. With all these varied interests around the table and the long history of extensive litigation, Mr. Rick has several layers to it. There are work groups and facilitators and a chair, all with the intention to foster communication and build trust. There was an independent science advisory panel that was created in about 2012 and has since played a key role in advising not only the Corps, but also the stakeholders within Mr. Rick. Perhaps the most unique trait about Mr. Rick is that we operate by consensus. Everyone around the table has an equal voice, and which can be a positive and a negative. Convening all those viewpoints, though, has allowed for trust building and increased transparency into decision making. One of the criticisms, though, of Mr. Rick is that there is a lot of process compared to the science. Research being conducted on the river and in labs is being discussed in those work groups and an independent science panel and throughout Mr. Rick. There is a fall science meeting where the year's research is presented, which helps inform the scientific process and management actions. There's also an adaptive management workshop, which takes place in the spring. And neither one of those activities occurred when Mr. Rick was first convened. But in my opinion, that's where the majority of the in the trenches work occurs in Mr. Rick, in those work groups and in those science meetings. The recovery program received its budget from Congress, which has fluctuated greatly over the years. I've seen it as much as like $70, $80 million, and last year was only $39 million, and this year for FY22, it's roughly $8.3 million. Mr. Rick has asked the Corps, why such a drastic cut in the budget, to which the Corps wasn't really sure what was going on, but we're trying to understand why there's been such a budget cut. In the last couple of years has been challenging for the recovery program, period. In 2019, there was historic flooding, and then the pandemic set in the following spring. And now there's budget complications or constraints, and there's still a pandemic. And even though a lot of functions within Mr. Rick have had to be curtailed, and not only within Mr. Rick, but within the recovery program, the majority of the money in the recovery program budget is being dedicated to the science. So for tonight's presentation, I want to focus solely on the pallet surgeon. And the factors affecting the pallet surgeon are similar between the upper basin and the lower basin, with habitat, flow or drift distance, and hybridization. But it's the focus of the management actions that are different between the two. All right, one second. Off in place. There we go. Pallet surgeon population in the upper basin is bounded by Fort Peck Dam. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'll go with that. Fort Peck Dam, intake dam on the Yellowstone River, and the upper ends of Lakes Kakawea. Understanding larval drift between Fort Peck and Lakes Kakawea is key, since embryos can drift for many days before they settle out of the water column. So are they drifting into the lake environment of Lakes Kakawea, which is not hospitable for a riverine species like pallet surgeon, or are the embryos getting caught in the channel margins where habitat is more suitable and allows for growth? Same is true for pallet surgeon that venture up the Yellowstone River. Pallet have been documented to spawn in the lower section of the Yellowstone River, but the drift distance may be too short for larval survival before they go into the upper ends of Lakes Kakawea. And the Corps has recently finalized an environmental impact statement that will allow them to do a test flow out of Fort Peck in hopes of increasing our knowledge on some of these issues. And you see on the slide, there's some of the big questions that remain, or that are the focus of the science in the upper basin. So like the upper basin, the main issues on the lower river that are debated in Mr. Rick are flow, habitat, and hybridization. For the lower basin, there is also a potential test flow out of Gavin's Point included in the adaptive management plan. That test flow, or the spring rise, is not currently planned since the Corps has opted to study the natural variability of the river, yet will reevaluate the need for that test in a couple of years. Hybridization is long thought to be complicating pallid sturgeon survival. Determining the causes of hybridization and if anything needs to be done about it are yet to be fully understood. The pallid population on the Missouri River and Mississippi River are proven to intermingle. So is habitat availability between the two river systems affecting hybridization, or is larval drift from the Missouri River into the Mississippi River the driver for hybridization in this part of its range? The habitat needs are being evaluated through construction of interception rearing complexes, or IRCs. A suite of 12 IRC pairs are thought to be needed to fully understand that this type of habitat would allow larval sturgeon to feed and grow on the channel margins. I have a slide of an IRC here in a second. To date, only a couple of IRCs have been constructed. It's these types of scientific questions that remain, which are complicated by the budgetary challenges, and it's also part of a human environment. So before undertaking any management action, you need to understand or avoid or mitigate for those potential impacts to the human environment. And it's those kinds of discussions that are ongoing in this direct. So this is a visualization of what an interception rearing complex would look like. The inside bend has slower moving water and over shallower depths compared to the outside bend. In these areas where it's thought to provide food and foraging habitat for larval sturgeon to grow big enough to thrive in the main channel. And the interception rearing complexes are being thought to be constructed adjacent to adjacent to public lands, and well, I'll show you the slide here in a second. There's a potential IRC location. So you can see how on the lower river, they are, the upstream is Princey Bend near Grand Pass, all the way down towards the confluence. And so these are potential areas that the Corps and the stakeholders within Mr. Rick are debating on whether or not the design of them or the location are suitable for not only pallid sturgeon and meeting the criteria that the Corps has set for location, but also meeting with the stakeholder groups that have raised concerns about, like I said, the location and the design. And it's mainly flood control and navigation interests that have raised the greatest concerns to date. But the Corps is working or attempting to work through those concerns with those stakeholders. And if it's possible to find win-win solutions for the IRCs and the potentially affected stakeholders, that is the meaningful dialogue that can occur within Mr. Rick. And it's competing interests often, species recovery and the impacted human environment, or potentially impacted human environment, where that is the true value of Mr. Rick and working through those issues together. I know I went through that pretty quick, but it's just a high-level overview of Mr. Rick and pallid sturgeon recovery efforts. And I know that there's a couple of Mr. Rick colleagues on the webinars on the Zoom this evening, and I'm sure they have some thoughts as well. But thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you, and if time allows, I'll take some questions.
Karen, thank you very much. We'll just kind of pause for a second and see if we get some questions floating in. And I do want to mention that it's possible with this webinar format that I can patch some people through on audio. So if any of those colleagues of Karen that have also worked on Mr. Rick, and I know in our conversation before, she she mentioned possibly Rob and David. If you guys do have a a question or a comment or something you'd like to add, it's possible that I might be able to patch your audio through. So maybe just add your question in the Q&A and we'll kind of see how that goes. But we've got a few questions floating in here. Oh, actually, one of them is from Rob. So Rob, I'm gonna try patching you through here. This is Rob Jacobson.
Rob always has such good questions.
Yeah, I feel like, so I have tried to add audio for Rob. Rob, you can see if you can unmute yourself and see if you can speak.
It says I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Fire away, Rob.
Well, my question, Karen, and thanks for that talk. Very, very useful stuff. We have a lot of, management debate on the Missouri River, but lurking in the background is climate change and how that's going to affect all these decisions and decision-making processes. And so I'm wondering, from where you sit representing the state of Missouri, what you can tell us about how the state is going to address climate change issues in the Missouri River Basin. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Rob. So climate change really has not been pointedly addressed, at least not to my knowledge, as it relates to the Missouri River Basin. I know through some discussions, we talked about hydrologic variability and how that's going to impact water supplies for drought, which kind of gets to a different question with that I believe has been posed, or in the next year, having record flooding again. So while not necessarily looking at it specifically to Missouri River Basin, but how climate change or that hydrologic variability impacts life along the Missouri River is something that we are currently discussing, of how to make river communities more sustainable to live along the Missouri River, or any water body really, and the relationship between the two. And, how can you prepare for record flooding one year and record drought the next, which isn't entirely unheard of for us, because when I came over to Kansas City in 2019, we were just coming out of a drought, and then we went directly into flooding, record flooding. And so that is something that we're trying to get a handle on, but that's more localized. And how do we make those communities more resilient?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for trying that out, Rob. And thank you, Karen, for addressing that. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Karen, on that topic?
No. I'm not sure if there's anything meaningful to add.
So. Also, as you noted, John Larondo,
Hi, John.
Also, an old colleague of yours.
John and I go way back.
John was asking how the drought of 2021 to 2022 would impact the recovery program in particular, and really anything else related to the river that you want to speak to.
If the Corps and service have discussed how the potential drought may impact the program, I am not aware. I know in years past, when we've had other droughts, you kind of roll with the punches a little bit, because you have, this time of year you have the science plan laid out for what you're going to do, or majority of it laid out for what you're going to do. And then if river conditions are, greater than what you planned for, then they try to adjust as best as possible with whatever monitoring actions that they may be undertaking. And the same thing with a drought. As best as they can, the Corps and the service and the partners that are involved in all of this also try to adjust to river conditions as best as possible and be opportunistic in those ways. So it's kind of hard to say exactly what they would be doing if X, Y, and Z happens, because, you know, everybody, a plan is as good as it is until, you know, until it starts hitting the fan, and then you try to adjust from there.
Larry Shepard also, who, as you mentioned, is represents recreation on the lower Missouri River for Mr. Rick. He said, we need many advocates to support our work on the committee. As the primary contact for lower basin recreation, I'm very interested in feedback from recreation users anytime. And Larry shares his email address in the Q&A, so you can, and actually in the chat as well, so you guys can check that out. You know, basically in the Mr. Rick committee, you know, Larry represents recreational users, and if you're a recreational user, you should talk to Larry and let him know what your experience is, and what your interests are related to the management of the Missouri River. So thanks for that, Larry.
One of the things I would add is, you know, before Mr. Rick, there was a lot, I heard a lot of sentiments that stakeholders didn't have an opportunity to interact with the Corps or the science or the Fish and Wildlife Service on a regular basis to not only understand the science, but also to have their concerns heard by, like, the lead federal agencies that we now have. And so I understand the conversation regarding how operating by consensus slows everything down. I understand that. However, I would offer that by having an equal voice, that all the stakeholders are then having their voice heard. And so I think that has been a real benefit, is that stakeholder interest, you know, of the, I can't remember how many there are now. Each one of them have an opportunity to have their voice heard on any particular issue within Mr. Rick, and have that dialogue with the decision makers within the Corps and the service on a regular basis. So that has been, to me, one of the things that has been unique and has brought a lot of meaning to it, because you're not relying on your on others to make the decision for you, or to have less of a voice in the room.
Karen, let's see, it looks like there might be one more question here. So David Galad is asking if the Department of Natural Resources has taken a position on the dramatic fiscal year 22 funding reduction to Mr. Rick. And if so, what is that position from the Department of Natural Resources?
We have not taken a position on the funding decrease.
And I've got one question that kind of follows on that. What's your understanding of where things stand right now with interception rearing habitats, which you talked about in your presentation? So there was a movement to stop those by the state of Missouri legislature. And then, of course, the funding decreases kind of really got dramatic after that. At this point, are there any plans to continue any kind of actual habitat construction at this point that you're aware of?
You know, that's a really good question, and I almost had the slide that had, like, the timeline that the Corps is working towards to resume construction of IRCs. And actually, within the work groups, that discussion just recently took place of, you know, are we going to get bogged down in debating the fine science of it, or, you know, at what point do we have enough of the concerns met or the science vetted before we can move forward. And I apologize for not having that timeline at the ready, but there is, and I can't remember what the timeline is. My great apologies. But if Dr. Galat or Dr. Jacobson have it off the top of their hands, throw a lifeline. But it's not never going to happen. There are meetings and, like I said, a timeline in place to resume construction.
Okay, awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to share the status of Mr. Rick, kind of where things are at right now. We really appreciate it. We know you've been working hard for the Missouri River for many years, and we appreciate the work you've done. And I do want to give, a shout out. Unfortunately, I didn't write this down, so I don't have the name of it, but the Department of Natural Resources did just honor Karen, and I think one other person with kind of, a like staff person of the year award. I forget what the actual name was, but like team member of the year or something like that. And I think that's a reflection of the good work you've been doing through your whole career. So,
well, I certainly can't take all the credit on that. It was a joint effort. Jennifer Hoggett in the Water Resources Center, she did a lot of the work, and my team here in Kansas City did a lot of the work. I am graciously riding on their coattails, but thank you for the recognition. It was to help out or get that the levee setback in Atchison County. So thank you. And I just want to point out one other thing in the chat. Larry mentioned the research station down in Vicksburg is doing a lot of the analysis, and that research station down there is top notch, and rightfully so. They've been intimately involved for many years. So anyway, thank you for allowing me to present, and at any time, if anybody has any questions, please let me know.
well, Karen, just to clarify,
On the DNR website.
The research station in Vicksburg, they're doing their analysis on the interception rearing habitat. Is that correct? Is that what you're referring to?
That is my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay, well, thank you, Karen, and welcome to Chris Wieberg. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining us this evening. And I guess I should pop my video on since I'm talking. So Chris is here to kind of totally shift gears. Chris works in the Water Protection Division of the Department of Natural Resources. So a lot of their work is done to ensure that everything is done in the state of Missouri to ensure top-notch water quality. So in particular, Chris is going to talk a little bit about a new study that's being done to try to quantify just what Missouri's impact is on particularly nutrient pollution into the Missouri River that also adds to the Mississippi River input into the Gulf Hypoxia Zone. So Chris, thank you for sharing your work with us this evening and shifting gears on our topic related to the Missouri River.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I end up having to correct a lot of people with regard to my name. It's Wieberg, not Weiberg. If you call my house and you ask for Mr. Weiberg, I probably won't answer the phone because it's usually like a telemarketer or something like that. But no worries, Steve. You're in good company with regard to the name.
I'm so sorry, Chris.
No worries. And I'm excited to see a lot of familiar names on the chat. Appreciative for the River Relief Organization for giving me the opportunity to talk about some of the work that I've been doing within the department, and I hope you find it interesting. What I'm going to talk about is something that rose from kind of a knowledge gap or a need to fill a hole with some information that we kind of struggled with over the years. And I titled the presentation, Innovative Approaches Enables Missouri to be Strategic About Soil and Water Conservation Investments. It's kind of a wordy title, but it really is what we sought out to do with regards to some of this work that we recently undertook. And one of the things that I always try to do in presentations is kind of give everybody a heads up what I hope that I can provide to you in terms of knowledge. And so I want to make sure that you briefly understand the Soil and Water Program. So when you see SWCP, that's the Soil and Water Conservation Program, which is a part of the Department of Natural Resources, and the Water Protection Program, which I'm the director of. And then I also want to give you a brief overview of the nutrient challenges that are in the Mississippi River Basin. Give you a bit of an introduction to Missouri's nutrient loss reduction strategy. Some of you may be familiar with it. Others may be like, what is that and what's its purpose? So I want to talk a little bit about that. Explain and the knowledge gap with regard to soil and water best management practices and nutrient reductions that are achieved by those best management practices, and then explain the recent project and methods that and the results that came about from our work to kind of study and figure out a standard operating procedure to evaluate much of the best management practices that the state funds each year, and then discuss some of the implications moving forward. So I worked for the Soil and Water Program for about 5 years. Back in around 2004 is where I started with the Department of Natural Resources, and my background is in agriculture, not necessarily in water quality. I just kind of evolved into being a guy that's interested in water quality and managing scientists and engineers and biologists with regard to water issues. But I started in soil and water, and I just want to give you a little background of what the Soil and Water Conservation does. It assists farmers and landowners with soil and water conservation practices. It's funded through the Parks and Soil Sales Tax. They offer a suite of practices, 52 to be exact. It covers the gamut with regard to agriculture. It from grazing, irrigation, woodland management, pest and nutrient management, etc. But its primary function is to abate soil erosion, and so that was kind of what the impetus was. And it's a very successful program, and there's roughly around $40 million annually that's put into conservation in the state as it relates to soil and water practices, and it has a high approval rating with voters. The Water Protection Program, a little bit different outfit with regard to the work that we do. We are primarily regulatory in the programs that we implement. We find our authorities from big, bulky federal regulatory acts like the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we do a lot of things related to permitting, inspection, and enforcement. But we also establish water quality standards that are used to protect the uses of water bodies as it relates to the waters of the state. And these designated uses could be anywhere from drinking water to aquatic life use protection. So I got a picture of those folks fishing there, whole body contact. But then also we do have uses that are agricultural uses, such as livestock watering uses. But at the same time, there are some competing interests in this slide with regard to livestock using that water body as a water source, but also its impact to our ability to use that water body as a swimming hole for whole body contact. And so we are continually working to regulate entities that pollute that are primarily point sources. We don't necessarily regulate non-point sources, but what we do work on with regard to non-point source pollution is related to our impaired waters list. So when we are assessing water bodies, identifying whether or not they're impaired for point source pollution or non-point source pollution. And primarily what we're going to talk about today is the effects of non-point source pollution on water bodies, and how that has lent itself to us wanting to learn more about how we can reduce non-point source pollution on land that's agriculture in nature. So just to give you a little brief history about some of the nutrient challenges, I like this slide because it shows how expansive the area that we're kind of working with here is. It is roughly a third of the country that feeds the Mississippi River Basin. It's a lot of land to manage with regard to this nutrient challenge that is in front of us. In around 1997, there was a task force established called the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force, and it was formed to evaluate the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The slide shows that little red area in the Gulf, kind of just depicts the general area of the zone that we're concerned with. And you can see, for reference, St. Louis and New Orleans on that map, identified as well by those dots. The task force basically was formed to evaluate the hypoxic zone and analyze data from 1980 to 1996 with regard to the size of the zone, and found that it grew and expanded by 40%. And that 40% is a key number because it's generally the reduction that we seek to achieve with regard to reductions in the basin as it relates to our plans for nutrient reductions. And I'll talk a little bit about how that kind of looks in a minute. But primarily, the cause of the zone is tied to landscape alteration as well as river channelization, and the increase in the usage of fertilizer as it relates to farming in many respects. The Midwest and the Basin has seen tremendous growth in agriculture across that time period. Much of that growth is tied to increasing yields and production by way of utilizing more commercial fertilizers, and that has been tied to an impact on the actual zone in the Gulf. So why does it matter? A depletion of that DO in that zone is having a negative impact on aquatic life, and that decrease in dissolved oxygen is directly tied to eutrophication, or the increase of nutrients that's leading to dissolved oxygen issues in the Gulf of Mexico. Is impacting shrimp harvest. It's been tied to significant declines in the 90s with regards to harvesting shrimp. Additionally, the zone is measured every year, and it saw its largest area in the 90s, and it was around 8,000 square miles. And like I said, it's basically doubled in size since we started measuring the zone early on. So the task force has developed action plans over the years and focused on different aspects of the problem. And in the early 2000s, emphasized nitrogen, while later emphasis was focused on phosphorus, but ultimately suggests that states need to strive for 45% reduction in nutrients by 2035. And that's using that 80 to 96 as the baseline for kind of establishing, where you start from. And so figuring out what reductions look like and measuring progress is kind of an important piece of the puzzle that states within the basin are all kind of struggling and grappling with. And that's one of the reasons why we sought to start to think about ways to quantify some of the inputs that we have with regard to conservation in the state. Just to give you another look at the zone as it was, back in August of 21. Like I said, each year they measure the zone. They go out and take DO measurements to try to figure out what the size is, and then they report out. That work is done by NOAA, and it is shifted from year to year, sometimes focused or because of the change in weather, prevailing winds, dry years versus wet years that have a high occurrence of hurricanes, and just different events affect the zone. But ultimately, and a little star there is to depict where New Orleans is, if you're familiar with kind of the lay of the land down there. and where the river kind of comes out and then has this impact on the general water quality in the Gulf of Mexico. So in Missouri, we developed a nutrient reduction strategy kind of in response to the Gulf Hypoxia or the Hypoxia task force charge to reduce nutrients by that 45%. And it was a 3-year period of stakeholder meetings to develop a plan that has basically a suite of objectives and goals and things to work on to reduce nutrients. And it goes across a lot of different sectors: point source objectives for non-point source, those that may be on agricultural land versus those that may be residential in nature, like on-site septic systems and those sorts of things. All of the individuals that are interested in those types of things were compiled into a work group and then came together to develop a reduction strategy that's still in place today. And some of the things I'm going to talk about here in a moment are related to the objectives that are in that reduction strategy with regard to non-point source best management practices on agricultural land. So for years, the Soil and Water Program has been implementing best management practices, and it's grown over the years to the current volume of around $40 million annually. This all started in about 1984 when it was first passed, and I think has grown, and I think it's actually doubled in value in terms of the amount of money that's used to implement these practices. The focus was on soil erosion abatement, and those of us that talk about soil and water BMPs have always known that there's a side benefit to conservation with regard to this sort of work, in that we were reducing nutrients, but there has never been an effort to really quantify what that means. Why is it important? Because if you recall earlier, the charge was to reduce nutrients by 45% in the basin and measure back to the baseline, which was 1980 to 1996. And so figuring out what this state investment is important for progress tracking, and is something that moving forward we have to get a handle on so that we can start figuring out whether or not we need to target conservation in the state in certain aspects, and what practices do we target. So you'll start to kind of get the picture I'm trying to paint here moving forward in some of the other slides. So we've been asking ourselves, how do we do that? So in 2019, there was an opportunity through a grant offered by US EPA to all the states within the Mississippi River Basin to receive some funding to do projects to further the progress in their nutrient reduction strategies. And so we secured that funding to answer some questions. And the question that we tried to answer was, how can we quantify these best management practices? And it was tied to some of the statements in the nutrient reduction strategy, and they're on the screen. I'll read them. One of the most important goals for the next few years is to create a strong framework for measuring results. We need to be able to estimate reductions in nitrogen and phosphorus loading to the nearby waters, and then subsequently the Gulf of Mexico, in order to understand water quality benefits and the overall cost effectiveness of the things that we're doing. That kind of can touch on a lot of different areas of the reduction strategy, whether you're talking about point source reductions through treatment or reductions in terms of non-point source pollution. But either way, it was pointed out during those discussions, it was important for us to know what it costs to do certain things, and how effective are we in reducing those nutrients. And so the project was focused on 2 watersheds and focused on 5 years worth of data from state fiscal year 15 to 19 in the South Grand River watershed, which is the watershed on the western side of the state here, just kind of south of Kansas City. And then also in the South Fork of the Salt River, which is up near the Mark Twain Lake area of the state. They're 2 geographically unique watersheds as compared to each other, and that was purposeful in that we wanted to evaluate kind of 2 areas of the state that had fair amounts of cost share going on in the soil and water program, had a fair amount of the practices that we were interested in evaluating. We weren't going to evaluate all 52 of them, and wanted to see what those practices look like whenever, compared to each other, but then also, evaluating them as unique watersheds. The practices that we sought to quantify were cover crops, grass waterways, ponds, terraces, and water sediment control basins. And I'm going to talk about what those things are here in a moment, just in case you're not in that space. And then as far as like value or cost spent during those 5 years, South Grand roughly $2.3 million on 392 practices versus in the Salt 4.7 million on almost double that, 692 practices. And so differing amounts spent in those watersheds. So let's talk about what these practices are I'm talking about. And I'm going to talk about ponds and water sediment control basins first, because they're kind of similar. A pond, which is on the left side of the screen, is used to abate some sort of gully erosion. So you have a very focused amount of erosion that's occurring on a piece of property. That erosion is bringing with it nutrients that are running off the landscape. And a pond does a really good job of kind of sinking those nutrients in that structure. That sediment tends to stay in that structure. And then as it gets up to the spillway pipe, it meters it out in a more controlled fashion. And then we also see a reduction in the amount of erosion and velocity and issues that occur downstream from that structure. It is a very expensive practice in a sense, because you're building a big dam and there's earth moving that has to occur and those sorts of things. And so there's that. And then you have your water and sediment control basins, or the acronym is WASCOB. And a WASCOB is kind of like a pond that only holds a very low amount of water on a normal basis. And then that structure will take on a lot of water, and the water level will raise up to the emergency spillway. And that structure in the middle that's got the tires on it on the right-hand side, that's got actually a pipe and a filter in it, and then it will slowly filter and meter out that water in a slower fashion. And then that water then is slowed in terms of velocity, and we've sunk some of the nutrients in the structure itself, but then also metered out the water in a slower fashion. I gave this presentation, or kind of portion of this presentation, at the Clean Water or the Water Protection Forum a couple months ago, and people asked me questions like, well, what does a pond have to do with nutrient reduction? Or what does a pond have to do with conservation of soil and water quality? And so I wanted to make sure and touch on like how these things work and why they're important. Terraces, I think if you go in North Missouri anywhere, you're going to see terraces, but just functionally they're used to like direct water, slow it down, step it down before it gets to the water body, slow it down in such a way that sedimentation or sediment starts to drop out, and increase infiltration, and really control that during a storm event. These can be coupled with tiles, which kind of change the nutrient aspect of the structure itself. Tiles or tile lines or piping that move water from one place to another. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Waterways, bottom left, waterways are used in conjunction with terraces in many respects. They tend to be vegetated waterways, so you have some infiltration. You also have vegetation slowing down the water. They are engineered structures to move water to a certain point in the field to also reduce the amount of erosion that would occur on that field. If you kind of get the point of everything so far is all about slowing water down, reducing velocity, and keeping soil where it's supposed to be, and then increasing the amount of infiltration that's occurring. And then finally, on the right-hand side is kind of a next-gen practice that hasn't been going on too terribly long. Maybe in the last 10 years, we've seen an uptick in the utilization of cover crops. Cover crops are used, and you plant them in the fall after harvest, and they take up additional nutrients. They provide for ground cover, which reduces the amount of erosion that occurs during rain events. They grow later in the season than other vegetation. And so you have that uptake occurring longer during the season. They also provide for additional soil enhancement or soil amendments. Some of the turnip crops and other root vegetable cover crops tend to add to the soil quality, and then actually have been tied to increasing yields in the next season by way of just having cover crops on there. So this practice has a lot of side benefits, and I think we're going to see a lot more cover crops, and it's going to be one of those things that we try to incentivize more moving forward in the state of Missouri. So now that you know about the practices, let me talk about the methods that we kind of went through. So we kind of scoured the literature to figure out what was kind of an implementable and cost-effective way for the department to do some of this evaluations. We landed on utilizing what's called STEP-L 2018, and STEP-L is a spreadsheet tool for estimating pollutant loads. It has algorithms built into it to help calculate what those loads would look like, and you're basically doing a modeling exercise. But it wasn't very cost effective for us to do modeling on a per practice basis. So we had to figure out a way to, as an aggregate, start to evaluate practices on that watershed scale. We used the STEP-L tool to figure out what those nutrient and sediment loads would be for the different types of land uses and different types of practices. And then we would be able to kind of evaluate that on a practice by practice basis. So in order to determine the reductions, though, with STEP-L, and so I know we got a lot of smart people on the webinar today, that some of which may have utilized STEP-L on very focused applications as it relates to looking at a specific farm or piece of land, or even maybe a little bit bigger watershed. But when you look at it from like the Huck 8 size, it gets very kind of big and it can get a little bit cumbersome. So we had to establish some default things when we established how we were going to do this on a watershed basis. So using the STEP-L practice efficiencies wasn't necessarily going to work. So we went and took a look at literature to get some more conservation practice specific values to help focus the STEP-L results, but not be too, we didn't want to overestimate the nutrient reductions. In fact, we would prefer to underestimate in many respects with regard to the results because of the broad nature of the evaluation. We used the watershed specific and county specific soil profiles to get a more precise soil phosphorus concentration to evaluate these practices, and then also using those county specific precipitation values. We used the STEP-L soil nitrogen values because there can be a high variability of soil nitrogen. And then I mentioned terraces kind of being unique. Earlier, terraces, we used the STEP-L gully stream bank calculation versus using, you can look at terraces in a couple ways. You can look at them from a gully perspective, that they're stopping that cutting in the field, or you can look at it from a sheet and reel perspective where you're looking at the acreage as a whole. There's benefits from both sides, but you can't really do both on a broad scale when you're looking at kind of coming up with an aggregate assessment of a watershed. And so once we got the TP and the TN reductions evaluated, we started taking a look at everything from the cost perspective, because we knew how much money we spent over that 5-year period on those practices. And recall that was a really important goal in the reduction strategy, was figuring out what the cost effectiveness looks like. So the next handful of slides can be a bit dense because it's really just the result of the evaluation. So in the South Grand, you can look at those differing practices, and you can see, just kind of go through the first line there. Ponds, 4 projects at $34,000 for all 4 projects. The tool was estimating for the 4 projects we were seeing for the lifespan of that pond, a reduction in 2,768 pounds of nitrogen mitigated, and then 1,488 pounds of total phosphorus mitigated. When I say the life of the practice, for ponds, we evaluated them over a 10-year lifespan, because that's what we established as a maintenance life for those practices. And 10 years is common for everything except for cover crops. Cover crops are an annual practice. You plant them in the fall, they're done in the spring. When you plow them under, you plant into them and plant your crop. So when we look at it from just a cost per pound perspective, because I think this is interesting, to evaluate cost effectiveness. If you do it for just nitrogen versus just phosphorus, if you're just hyper focused on, what it would be for one pollutant only, obviously the number is going to be higher. But when you combine the total cost per pound, you get something that's in the range from around $8 down to $3. And I always tell people here that, that's the cost of mitigation. And, we need to think about that in the context of what the nutrient actually costs, commercially. The cost for, nitrogen, phosphorus, fertilizer per pound is pretty cheap. Actually, it's less than $1. And so, I think the most important takeaway, or one of the really important takeaways from this conversation, is that it's actually cheaper if we can do practices that mitigate the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus we need to grow, we need to put on the land to get the desired yields that we want to get. It's much more expensive to build structures to try to mitigate it after the fact. So looking at the salt, just similarly, what you'll find when you compare both watersheds, that there's actually some differences in what the effectiveness of the specific practices for that watershed for that time period. And I think it's a matter of just the data wasn't as rich for one watershed as the other, and there just wasn't as many practices in the Grand versus the salt. And so as you get more practices and you evaluate more information, you start to get a more accurate value for what the practice can actually achieve. And you start to think about, well, what can I use this information for? It really can be utilized well for evaluating the total benefit from the fund that's spent every year, but also start to think about whether or not it's of value to start focusing on maybe cover crops, because they have a high cost efficiency, and we can put in a lot of acres and get a lot of reductions for a lower amount every year. And so that's just some of the thoughts that are going through our minds as we're evaluating these handful of watersheds. And then if you really want to look at it and compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges, you can kind of lay them side by side and can look at how it is different from the South Grand to the South Fork. But again, I think most of the variability that you see ends up being because of the volume of practices. And I think Terraces is a good a place to look, where we did 125 projects at $1.4 million in the South Grand. We did double that for double the amount of money. But then there's these characteristics in each of the watershed that lead to different efficiencies in their ability to actually reduce nutrients, whether that's land slope, soil types. So not everything is created equal in any of this. And so it's kind of challenging to parse through the data and figure out what's the action item here. I think the action item is ultimately, and I'll talk about it in the context, and here's another slide for phosphorus, similar information, that planning ahead, we're going to have to do more evaluations of more watersheds in order to get a bigger, more robust data set for these 5 practices. And then also, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there's 52 practices, and I think 10 practices within the soil and water program make up 90% of their work. And so we have some other practices that need to be evaluated in some respect, and then some just can't be evaluated with Step L, like grazing practices, or even stream bank erosion is kind of difficult in Step L when you look at it over a watershed basis. So there's a lot of unanswered questions still yet, and sometimes that's how research goes. You end up with more questions than answers at the end of it. Our takeaways are that we need to do more. We need to start building a mechanism to track progress, which is something we're thinking about doing in the coming years, and then figuring out how to feed this information into progress tracking, into a progress tracking spreadsheet or report out, so that we can start to figure out, really how far have we made it in this game of reducing nutrients by 45% in the state. Because this is the ag side of it, the non-polling side of it is actually the kind of the biggest bulk of it, but the hardest piece to really get work done in, because of the voluntary nature of the programs. And lastly, just my name and contact information. And I'm always interested in talking about nutrient reductions and how we're working on it, and talking about ideas and things of that nature. So if folks have comments or questions or want to be involved, you can reach out to me, and happy to work with you. With that, I'll take some questions.
Awesome. Chris, thank you so much for that deep dive into how, your process of trying to evaluate the success of some of these programs implemented across the state. Just really, really eye-opening. So we do have a few questions. You mentioned when you were discussing terraces, you mentioned drain tiles, and Elka Boyd has a question kind of related to drain tiles. So she said that from a drinking water quality perspective, drain tiles have caused really a major problem for surface water and drinking water quality for the city of Des Moines. Basically, all of the BMPs that you mentioned, the practices that you mentioned, in some ways, drain tiles sort of circumvent some of that, unless they're obviously used in tandem, right? But the belief is that, well, I know that the city of Des Moines, one of their big drinking water problems is nitrates, agricultural runoff, and drain tiles kind of basically create an underground way to move water off of fields into adjacent streams. So her question is like, how prevalent are drain tiles in combination with terraces in Missouri, or really even in general in especially northern Missouri? And are they a water quality problem in the state?
Tile terraces are definitely popular in Iowa, and have been for a long time. And so we definitely see some of that practice, kind of fall south into Missouri. I will say though that tile terraces aren't they're as popular as non-tile terraces. Okay, but probably a quarter of the terraces constructed in the soil and water program, and I'm just guessing on that percentage, but it's not half. It's less than half. I'd say quarter are terraces with tiles in conjunction with the actual structural piece of the terrace. Now, from a phosphorus perspective, there's in my mind probably not much of a delta in terms of the difference between a tile terrace versus a regular terrace, but you definitely hit the nail on the head with regard to nitrogen, and I think that assertion is definitely something that kind of came about with the litigation and the Des Moines Water Works case, and the drainage district up there, and a lot of people started studying and evaluating the difference between tile terraces and traditional terraces that were just structural. It's led to some new practices, some of which we do offer in Missouri, kind of on a pilot phase. So routing terraces that have tiles to bioreactors, and also saturated buffers, and actually working to tie those two practices together in a pilot phase is something that we're working on, and I think you'll see more of that. And that's where as we do research like this, or we some university does a study on some edge of field monitoring study, which we got some of that going on in the state of Missouri. We start to figure out on very specific levels what's going on. We're also evaluating on broad levels so that we can kind of talk about it from the basin standpoint, and then figure out, okay, where's the juice worth the squeeze? Bioreactors aren't super popular because they take up land, and that land won't ever be able to be used for production. And so the incentive on something like that has to be, you have to be very careful on what you want to do with regard to that incentive, because I think you may not have people participate if you don't incentivize it. But you're exactly right. It's something that's being evaluated.
Cool, thank you. John Larondo asked, in general, not obviously not in this project, but in general, does water protection look at runoff impacts from urban lands? And he just gives his anecdote. I have a beautiful yard in Omaha, but I'm sure I have large fertilizer, herbicide, and various bug killer runoffs. So is the city runoff worse than ag in
I
terms
think
of pollutants?
I've taken a look at some of the SWOT. We've put together some SWOT models, which is just another model. I know I'm throwing some acronyms at a lot of people that may not know what they mean, but SWOT models as well as Sparrow models done by USGS that looked at like what are the major nutrient pollution sources and try to put a kind of a percentage on it. And when we talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, where the big ticket items are the nutrient non-point stuff that's on ag land. But urban runoff isn't to be, I think it's like 8%, of the total, so it's definitely worth working on. The non-point nutrient contributions in urban areas are different nuts to crack, like you pointed out. Some of it is, lawn runoff. The folks that people in urban areas tend to maybe hire some of that out, and those folks come to your lawn and they get paid to make your lawn green. Well, what makes lawns green the best? It's like putting lots of nitrogen on it, and then it rains, and then it runs off into the storm sewer system, and then we have that making it to our water body. So like 319 efforts have been working on evaluating and reducing those types of pollution sources on very local scales. The water program just recently reassumed responsibility for the 319 program. So I've been meeting with all of our 319 folks here recently and learning more about their work. And they had previously been housed in the soil and water program. And I think, while that maybe worked for a while, I think we got some opportunities from the water program perspective to learn a little bit more about non-point source pollution issues in 319. They don't just do urban stuff. They also do non-point source rural stuff too. So they kind of just got that non-point source world to work in. But as far as like a specific evaluation I could point to, I know there's studies out there, and I think it's about 8 to 5% of the load. So
does that also include like urban point source nutrients, which, what I'm thinking of is wastewater overflows,
right.
rain events and all of that kind of stuff?
If it's a sanitary sewer overflow, then that bacteria that comes from that ends up being characterized as like non-point source pollution, because it ends up being run off and it's not planned as a point source. It's just an accident, or a blockage or a clog. It's a result of infrastructure being aged and needing to be improved. If it's a combined sewer overflow, which is kind of a planned design thing, that's a point source. And obviously those pipes, the effluent pipes that come out, those are point sources. The tricky part about urban areas is that the MS4, the municipal separate storm sewer system, that's a point source, but it walks and talks like non-point in a sense because of how it flows off the land. So it ceases to be non-point, or it ceases to be a point source whenever it exceeds what is defined as, and I'm going to say something that's regulatorily kind of dense, and that's, it goes beyond what is determined to be the maximum extent practicable. Okay, that's something that the Clean Water Act had written into it, and it basically said for your city over here that has responsibility for MS4, you have to determine how much stormwater is practicable to control and reduce pollution in, and then once it got beyond practicable, then that ended up being non-point source pollution. And where that line is drawn is always a very regulatory heavy argument that we at DNR get into with people sometimes. We're trying to grow that program as well, but some of it's point and some of it's non-point. So not a very simple answer to your question.
Okay. Rob Jacobson has another question. Basically starting with a comment. I mean, this is a multi-state problem. Are the other states in the Mississippi River Basin pulling their weight? Are things comparable to what Missouri is able to do with our soils tax, parks and soils tax? Are other states able to invest that kind of effort or impact into reducing nutrient load into the entire basin?
The Missouri Parks and Soil Sales Tax is the envy of the Midwest with regard to soil and water conservation. And so I would say that we're doing quite a bit more than the other states with regard to conservation. That's, there's similar setups though. In Minnesota, they have what's called, it's like the Bureau of Soil and Water Management. The acronym is Bowser, but they don't have the same level of funding, in that respect. But what Minnesota does have is they have a very active legislature that has identified that water quality is really important to their state, that have focused on things like buffer laws and other aspects of nutrient reduction to pull points and non-point sources together to address issues with regards to nutrient pollution in different ways. In the state of Iowa, I'm aware of the legislature. They're putting a considerable amount of state funding towards promoting cover crops. Millions of dollars towards cover crops in Iowa. So there's just different things going on in different states. It's hard to compare everybody. We all have reduction strategies. I will say that the states in the upper Mississippi River Basin, which is Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, we meet several times a year as part of the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association, which was established by the different governors in the state as directed by some federal legislation many years ago. And we meet on things like water quality. We meet on things like navigation issues, water volume. I know this is a Missouri River group, but it's just that group ends up being the catalyst for conversations about what's going on in the basin with regards to nutrient reductions. And that's where we learn about other stuff that's going on in those states, but then also they get to learn about what we have going on as well.
Awesome. Mark Osborne is curious, is there any plan to address CAFOs in quantifying nutrient loading? So you were talking a lot about croplands, but
yeah,
livestock.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Good to hear from you. I would say that right now we're characterizing, CAFO. Well, we have to be careful. Like there's CAFOs that we regulate, and then there's AFOs that are not regulated by the department in the same way. But land application, as it relates to the waste that's generated at those facilities, is considered fertilizer, and if applied consistent with a nutrient management plan, we consider that non-point. So any water that runs off of that would be non-point source water, and any pollution that comes from that would be non-point source pollution. So the regs are clear that identifies them as a point source, so long as they follow certain aspects, and then that water is agricultural non-point source. So it kind of falls in that bin. That's not to say that there aren't best management practices that are utilized on those fields and those operations. One of the major practices that's required by their permits is that they have to develop a nutrient management plan. Nutrient management planning is a BMP in a sense, because you're being forced to apply to that crop need, and you're not allowed to over apply, so that you're maximizing utilization of the nutrient and not over applying and allowing some of it to get run off. So there are BMPs that are occurring on those lands, some of them forced by permit requirements, and then other of those, I'm sure state cost share has been utilized to build terraces and waterways on lands that are basically using exported CAFO waste. So those practices are in there as well.
We've got a few more questions, so I'm gonna just go ahead and roll into those, Chris, if you don't mind. So Ryan McCoy on YouTube is asking if the recent back and forth with the definition of the waters of the U.S. at the federal level, does that conversation and impact like the work that you're doing and discussing here in terms of nutrient reduction?
Um, I don't think it has any impact on the nutrient reduction space. Because we're concerned with all land that forms the Mississippi River Basin, regardless of whether that water body that is in that landscape or in that space is defined as a navigable water or not, because it all flows to the Mississippi River eventually. It all gets there eventually. From a regulatory perspective, our Clean Water Act work, while our authority comes from the act and we focus on discharges to waters of the U.S., we also have state laws that are more stringent than the waters of the U.S. definition, and that it defines waters of the state based upon property boundaries. So many of the water bodies that may have been argued about in other states because they weren't jurisdictional under the national definition, you come to Missouri and we're like, that's a water of the state regardless, so you need to get a permit for your pollution exercise because the Missouri Clean Water Law was more stringent and still is more stringent. And that definition still lives today in terms of water of the state and permit applicability. So from a regulatory perspective, we didn't see much of a difference either. Now, where there was an impact in Missouri, slight impact, I should say, and really the Trump era, I forget what it was called, we'll just call it WOTUS rule, that rule was really only in effect for like a year and a couple months. And so not a tremendous amount of projects happened, not a tremendous amount of jurisdictional determinations happened during that time frame. And really, it'll kind of make it difficult to evaluate the true impact, positive or negative, of the Trump era rule because it just wasn't in place long enough for decisions to be made under it. That being said, we did see we didn't see, I guess we should say, we didn't see 401 certifications come in for waters that would have been ephemeral ephemeral. And so, we would assume there was a reduction in 404 and 401 projects for dredge and fill in ephemeral waters, very high up in watersheds and those sorts of things. And, I'm not aware of any wetland projects that occurred where, it wasn't determined to be adjacent to, because adjacent was still in, but non-adjacent was out. And, there could have been a reduction in projects there for wetlands, but I was never made aware of any of that. So really, I kind of, when I get that question, and I get it every once in a while, I'm like, it wasn't super impactful for our work regulatorily. Like we ended up doing the same thing we were doing before the rule. Now, was it impactful for a state that had a non-adjacent wetland that, was, maybe, I think each state had a little bit different characterization of the impact, and some of it was related to the lack of state laws to help protect the state. So.
Okay, thanks. These are, often complicated questions, and thanks for taking your stab at kind of laying it out for us. It's really helpful.
Yeah.
So Jeannie Heuser has what at this point I think is our last question, and was wondering. Well, I'll just use her question. Could you comment on the thought that tile drains actually turn non-point source agricultural runoff into a point source of pollution by rushing the nitrogen straight to receiving streams?
So I'll just kind of say what I think the court said when they answered that question, and that they did not determine that tile drains were point sources in the Des Moines case. And so I think there's still a lot of conversation around that. Regardless of whether you call it point or non-point, the impact to the water quality is the same. It's just a matter of some sort of regulatory mechanism that people sought to regulate them as point sources because the hand is heavier, right? I get it. I think the courts said that it wasn't a point source in the Clean Water Act. And so then, you're still kind of working in that non-point source space. So impairments addressed through incentives like 319 programs and, working with that drainage district to try to come to an equitable solution. with regard to reductions. So yeah, that's my answer there. Good question, Jeannie.
Awesome, thank you. Gonna poke back at YouTube. Yeah, but I think that's it. That's all the questions we've got. Thank you so much, Chris. And Chris Wieberg, I will hopefully get your name right from now on. That's
Yeah, I got you.
And I think Karen is still with us as well. So Karen, thank you very much for sharing your perspective on DNR's work with the Missouri River and Mr. Rick. You guys, we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. And I just do want to give a huge thank you, to everyone that tuned in tonight. It's been, like I said, I think it's been 5 or 6 months since we've done one of these talks. So it was super great. At one point we had, I believe 90 people watching the streaming presentation. So that's super. That's just awesome. It's great to see some of your names here. I wish I was seeing your faces too. Our goal is to, by April or May, get back to live presentations, probably at Les Bourgeois Bistro. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted on how the speaker series progresses, and hopefully as the pandemic ebbs away, we can get back to getting together and sharing space together. Good night to everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye, all.